I am Valerie, and at 32 years old, I never expected my postpartum recovery to turn into a federal crime scene. Just 3 weeks after giving birth to my son Miles, I bought my absolute dream home. I wanted a peaceful place to heal and bond with my baby. But on our very first night in the house, my mother-in-law Brenda called at 2 in the morning. She told me she was moving in tomorrow along with my entitled sister-in-law and her condescending husband. When she told me she did not care about my boundaries, and my husband Devon agreed with her, I did not scream or cry. I just smiled and told them to come on over. They had absolutely no idea who was actually waiting for them inside. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic in-laws who tried to take over your life. The glowing red numbers on my nightstand clock read 2:14 in the morning. The house was completely silent except for the soft, rhythmic breathing of my newborn son Miles resting against my chest. My body was still aching from a difficult delivery, and I had barely slept in weeks. Beside me, Devon was snoring softly, oblivious to my exhaustion. We had just moved into this sprawling Victorian-style mansion the day before. It was supposed to be our fresh start. Then his phone shattered the quiet. He fumbled for it before hitting answer and putting it on speakerphone. "Valerie, is that you awake?" I heard Brenda demand. My mother-in-law never bothered with greetings. She was the self-proclaimed matriarch of her church board, demanding absolute submission from everyone around her. I shifted Miles gently to protect his ears. "Yes, Brenda, we are both awake now." "Good, because I need you to leave the front gates unlocked tomorrow morning," Brenda announced as if she were ordering a coffee. "Jasmine and Trevor and I are packing up the truck right now. We are moving into the new house tomorrow." I froze. Jasmine was his 30-year-old sister who refused to hold down a job, and Trevor was her white husband who ran a failing craft brewery while constantly talking down to me about business. "What do you mean moving in?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low so I would not wake the baby. "Just what I said," Brenda snapped back. "Your new house is huge. It has 6 bedrooms. I am not about to stay in my place when my only grandson is way out in the suburbs. We are coming to stay indefinitely to help raise him. And do not even think about handing me that ridiculous list of postpartum rules you printed out. I raised 2 kids and I do not do boundaries for my own grandchild. If you do not like it, you can pack your bags and leave." I turned to look at Devon, fully expecting my husband to defend our peace. I expected him to remind his mother that we had explicitly agreed on no overnight guests for the first 2 months. Instead, Devon sat up and rubbed his eyes. "Mom is right, Val," Devon mumbled, not even looking at me. "It is a big house. We have the space. They are my family, and they just want to be close to the baby. You are overreacting because of your hormones." I stared at the man I had married, the man whose entire lifestyle I had funded since we met. I was a cybersecurity director for a major financial technology firm, making 4 times his salary. I paid off his student loans. I paid off his car. I even quietly paid the property taxes on her house 2 years ago, when Devon begged me crying that his mother would be publicly humiliated at church if she lost her home. And now he was using my postpartum hormones against me to let his mother stage a home invasion. Devon puffed out his chest. "I am the man of this house," Devon declared. "I have the right to invite my family to our home. You need to learn how to compromise and be a supportive wife. If my mother wants to move into our house, she is moving in." I looked down at Miles. His tiny hands were curled into fists against my shirt. I looked back at Devon, and then at the phone where Brenda was practically purring with satisfaction. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or throw a fit the way they clearly wanted me to. A cold, absolute calm washed over my entire body. I smiled in the dark, a smile that would have terrified Devon if he had bothered to look at my face. "Perfect," I said, my voice smooth and sweet. "Bring everyone, Brenda. We will see you tomorrow morning." Devon sighed heavily, muttering something about how I was finally learning to be reasonable before he rolled over and went right back to sleep. I walked out of the bedroom and went straight down the hall to my new home office. I closed the door quietly behind me and opened my laptop. The blue light from the screen illuminated the dark room as I pulled up a highly encrypted folder. I picked up my phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a sharp alert voice answered. Attorney Harrison speaking. It was nearly 3 in the morning, but my lawyer was always available for me. Harrison? I said, staring at the digital deed to the house on my screen. The house Devon thought he had a claim to. They are coming tomorrow morning to take over the property. Execute the protocol. I want the security team at the front door by 8 sharp. I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the empty driveway. They thought they could walk all over me because I was a healing mother. They thought this was their house. They had absolutely no idea what they were walking into. I knew tomorrow would be the most chaotic day of my life, but I was completely ready to protect my son and my peace. The morning sun crept through the sheer curtains of the master bedroom, casting a pale light across the floorboards. I was already awake. I had been awake since the phone call, pacing the floor of the nursery with Miles pressed against my chest. His small, warm body was a steady reminder of exactly what I was fighting to protect. Devon woke up around 7 o'clock, stretching and letting out a loud yawn, completely unbothered by the life-altering betrayal he had endorsed just a few hours prior. He sat up on the edge of the bed and looked at me with a smug, satisfied expression. He thought he had won. He thought my silence during the night was a surrender. He told me to go make some coffee and start clearing out the guest rooms, because his mother liked the one with the attached bathroom and Jasmine would need the room with the best lighting for her social media posts. I did not argue. I just nodded, calmly handed Miles over to the private night nurse I had hired, and walked downstairs to prepare the foyer for our guests. The heavy rumble of a diesel engine broke the quiet serenity of our suburban neighborhood right at 8 o'clock. The screech of air brakes echoed through the thick glass of the front windows. I stood off to the side, watching through the sheer panels as a massive moving truck aggressively hopped the curb. The driver did not even attempt to stay on the paved driveway. The heavy tires tore deep, muddy trenches directly into the pristine green lawn I had just paid a premium landscaping company to install. Devon came jogging down the sweeping grand staircase, smoothing his shirt and checking his hair in the hallway mirror. He practically vibrated with excitement, ready to play the role of the generous provider and head of the household. I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway and watched the front doors as the heavy footsteps approached the porch. Through the glass side lights, I could see the three of them marching up the front walk like an invading army. Brenda led the charge, wearing an oversized designer coat that I knew for a fact was bought on clearance and a pair of dark sunglasses, despite the overcast morning sky. She was pointing her finger and directing the movers with frantic, aggressive gestures, making sure they knew exactly who was in charge. Right behind her walked Jasmine, holding a single luxury handbag while letting the hired help carry everything else. She was already filming a video on her phone, panning the camera across the exterior of the mansion, and undoubtedly telling her non-existent followers about her fabulous new living situation. Trailing behind them was Trevor. He walked with that lazy, entitled gait he always carried into my home. His face was flushed, and he had a smug grin plastered across his face as he stepped onto the expensive stone tiles of the front porch. Devon threw open the front doors with a massive welcoming smile. He stepped out onto the porch to greet them, opening his arms wide to pull his mother into a dramatic embrace. I could hear every word they said echoing through the grand entryway. Brenda loudly proclaimed that it was about time Devon stepped up and took control of his household. She said, "A man needs to surround himself with his real family to make a house a home." Devon soaked up the praise, puffing his chest out and agreeing with every word. Then, Trevor stepped forward and slapped Devon hard on the shoulder. "Good job putting the wife in her place, buddy," Trevor said. his voice dripping with that familiar patronizing tone he always used when discussing me. "You finally showed her who wears the pants around here. Women get a little crazy after having a baby, and you just have to remind them who is actually running the show." Devon laughed, a weak, eager laugh that made my stomach turn. He told Trevor that I was in the kitchen crying and packing up my ridiculous list of rules. They pushed past Devon, eager to march into the house and claim their territory. They expected to steamroll right over me. They expected to find a weeping, exhausted postpartum woman desperately trying to salvage her authority. They pushed the heavy oak doors fully open and stormed into the grand foyer, their shoes tracking mud and dirt from the ruined lawn onto the imported marble tiles. Brenda opened her mouth to shout my name and demand that I come take her coat. Jasmine raised her phone, ready to capture my humiliation on camera. Trevor crossed his arms, ready to deliver another condescending lecture about family dynamics. But as they crossed the threshold, the loud, aggressive energy completely evaporated. The words died in Brenda's throat. Jasmine lowered her phone, her mouth falling open. Trevor froze in his tracks, his smug grin instantly vanishing. The grand foyer was not empty, and I was certainly not crying. I was sitting comfortably at a small antique table positioned perfectly in the center of the room. The morning light caught the steam rising from the delicate porcelain teacup in my hands. I took a slow, deliberate sip of Earl Grey tea and let the silence stretch out, allowing them to fully process the scene in front of them. To my immediate right stood Attorney Harrison. He was wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, holding a thick leather binder, and looking at my in-laws with the cold, calculating gaze of a man who destroyed people for a living. Flanking me on either side were two massive private security contractors. They were dressed in matching black tactical gear, standing with their feet planted apart and their hands resting casually near their utility belts. Their presence alone commanded absolute authority and completely changed the oxygen in the room. But the private security and the lawyer were not what made my in-laws freeze in terror. Standing just behind the security contractors, blocking the hallway that led to the rest of the house, were two fully uniformed local police officers. The officers had their hands resting on their duty belts, and they were staring directly at Devon, Trevor, Jasmine, and Brenda with stern, unamused expressions. The moving truck driver who had followed them up to the porch took one look at the police officers, dropped the box he was carrying, and backed away toward the lawn. The absolute silence in the foyer was deafening. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The reality of the situation was crashing down on them, but their arrogant minds could not compute what their eyes were seeing. I carefully placed my teacup down on the matching porcelain saucer. The soft clink of the ceramic echoed sharply in the quiet room. I looked at Devon, who was standing in the doorway, looking like all the blood had been drained from his body. I looked at Trevor, whose arrogant posture had collapsed into a slight tremble. I looked at Jasmine, who was trying to hide behind her mother. Finally, I looked at Brenda. The shock on her face was quickly replaced by a furious red flush that crept up her neck. She refused to accept that her grand entrance had been completely dismantled. Her hands balled into fists, and she turned her furious gaze toward my husband. "Devon!" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the high ceilings. "Kick these cops out of your house right now!" Devon flinched at the sound of his mother's screeching command. He looked at the police officers and then back at me, his face twisting from shock into a mask of arrogant annoyance. He genuinely believed he could just talk his way out of this. He always thought his deep voice and his mid-level management title gave him some kind of supreme authority over everyone in the room. He rolled his shoulders back, puffed out his chest, and took a confident step toward the two uniformed officers. "Gentlemen, there has obviously been a huge misunderstanding," Devon said, using his polished corporate voice. "I am the head of this household and the owner of this property. My wife just gave birth and her hormones are completely out of control. She is suffering from severe postpartum anxiety and clearly panicked when she saw the truck. You can go ahead and head back to the station. I apologize for my wife's hysterical behavior, but I have everything handled from here. The officers did not even blink. They did not holster their radios, and they certainly did not head for the door. The taller officer crossed his arms over his chest and looked Devon up and down with absolute indifference. "Sir, we received a call from the legal homeowner regarding an unauthorized intrusion," the officer stated flatly. "We are not leaving until the homeowner explicitly tells us the situation is resolved." Devon let out an exasperated sigh and ran his hands over his face. He turned his back on the officers and glared at me. "Valerie, tell them to leave right now," Devon demanded. "You are embarrassing me in front of my family and wasting police resources. I bought this house for us to raise our son in. You do not get to call the cops when I invited them to live here." I kept my hands resting gently on the table and did not break eye contact with him. "You are absolutely right, Devon," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "A man should have the right to invite whoever he wants into his own home. Unfortunately for you, this is not your home." Jasmine let out a loud, dramatic scoff. "What is she saying?" Jasmine sneered. "Tell this crazy woman to put her tea down and stop playing games." Trevor muttered about how he would never let his wife disrespect him in public. Harrison stepped from the shadows. He stopped right next to my table and dropped a massive black leather binder onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed through the foyer. "Good morning, everyone," Harrison said, his voice projecting absolute legal authority. "I am William Harrison. I am the managing partner at Harrison and Associates, and I represent the legal interests of my client, Valerie Vance." I could see the first real cracks of panic forming around Devon's confident facade. "What do you mean?" Devon asked. "We are married. What is mine is hers. I signed the mortgage papers last month. My name is on the deed. Tell these cops to get out before I report them for harassment." Harrison opened the binder and pulled out a stack of legal documents. "Mr. Vance, your name is nowhere on any document associated with this property," Harrison read aloud. Brenda stepped forward, her jaw dropping as she stared at the papers. "What do you mean his name is not on it?" Brenda yelled. "They bought this house together. My son is the provider. This property was not purchased with a mortgage." Mr. Vance Harrison continued. "It was purchased in its entirety for cash exactly 3 weeks ago. The sole legal owner of this estate is an entity registered as Miles Legacy LLC." Devon stumbled backward a step, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find words that simply were not there. He looked at me, his eyes wide with rising terror. "Miles Legacy," Devon whispered. "Valerie, what did you do?" I took a slow sip of my tea. "I protected my son," I said softly. "Miles Legacy, LLC is a corporation owned 100% by me, and before you claim this is marital property, I will save you the trouble. This LLC was fully funded by the protected inheritance my grandfather left me before we met. Not a single penny of shared funds was used. You have zero equity here and zero legal rights. You are nothing more than a guest severely overstaying your welcome." The taller police officer took a step forward, resting his hand on his utility belt. "You heard the lady," the officer said, looking directly at Devon and his family. "The legal homeowner wants you off the property. You are all currently trespassing. I suggest you turn around and walk back to your moving truck before we start making arrests." Jasmine started crying immediately, whining that she had already given up her apartment lease. Trevor took 3 quick steps backward, physically distancing himself from Devon, but it was Brenda's reaction that stole the show. My mother-in-law turned completely pale. The fake tan and heavy makeup on her face suddenly looked like a mask painted over a ghost. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. She turned slowly to look at Devon, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. "If your name is not on the deed," Brenda whispered, her voice trembling with absolute panic. "If she bought this house in cash with her own money, then what happened to the loan? You said you secretly mortgaged your joint accounts for this. You told me you needed cash to secure the closing." Devon held his hands up in a defensive gesture, backing away from his mother. "Mom, please," Devon stammered, sweating profusely. "We can talk about this later. Let us just go outside." Brenda lunged forward and grabbed Devon by the collar of his jacket. "I am not going anywhere," Brenda screamed, shaking him violently. "Where is the $150,000 I gave you for the down payment?" The entire room completely froze in silence. Even the police officers raised their eyebrows in surprise. I smiled, setting my teacup down on the saucer with a gentle clink. "Yes, Devon," I calmly asked, tilting my head and looking at my terrified husband. "Where is it?" Devon opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His face had drained of all color, leaving him looking like a pale ghost trembling in the morning light that streamed through the glass doors. A heavy bead of sweat rolled down his temple and dripped onto his collar. He looked from me to his mother, and then darted his eyes toward the marble floor, as if he was praying for a sinkhole to open up and swallow him whole. Brenda did not let go of his shirt. In fact, her grip tightened with a violent sudden jerk, her knuckles turning stark white as she shook him again. The expensive fabric of his jacket strained under her absolute fury. "I asked you a question, Devon," she shrieked, her voice bouncing harshly off the high ceiling of the foyer and making the crystal chandelier vibrate. "Where is my $150,000? You swore to me that you needed that money to secure the closing on this house. You told me that Valerie had ruined her credit score with reckless spending, and you had to step up to put a roof over your child's head. You looked me directly in the eyes and promised it was an investment in my grandson's future." Devon raised his hands in a weak defensive gesture, desperately trying to pry his mother's rigid fingers off his lapel. "Mom, please calm down," he stuttered, his voice cracking and pitching upward into a terrified whine. "I can explain everything. I promise, just let go of me and we can go back to your house to talk about this privately. We really should not be doing this here in front of these people." He gestured frantically toward the police officers and my private security team, who were watching the domestic meltdown unfold with absolute professional indifference. Attorney Harrison simply adjusted his glasses and casually flipped to the next page in his binder, completely unbothered by the screaming taking place mere inches from his shoes. "I am not going anywhere until you tell me exactly where my money is," Brenda screamed, refusing to loosen her iron grip on his clothes. Her breathing was ragged and heavy, and the perfectly cultivated image of the wealthy suburban matriarch she tried so desperately to project was utterly shattered. She was practically foaming at the mouth, realizing that the golden child she had elevated and worshipped above everyone else had just scammed her out of a massive chunk of her life savings. Devon swallowed hard, his eyes darting wildly around the room before finally settling on his brother-in-law. "Mom, it was a bridge loan," Devon pleaded, his voice shaking with desperation. "Trevor had a massive expansion plan for the brewery. It was a sure thing, I swear. He just needed a bridge loan to keep the commercial lease afloat until the summer crowds came in and the new marketing campaign launched. He promised me he would pay it back with 20% interest before closing day on the house. I thought I could double your money, Mom. I was just trying to be the man of the family and multiply our wealth so you would not have to worry about retirement." I set my teacup down and let out a dry, hollow laugh that cut right through his pathetic excuses. "Multiply our wealth," I repeated, letting the words drip with absolute venom. "That is a fascinating choice of words, Devon, especially considering you did not just stop at defrauding your own mother. You see, Brenda, your son was so desperate to play the role of the big-shot investor for his brother-in-law that he decided $150,000 was not quite enough to save a sinking ship." The room grew impossibly quiet again. Even Jasmine stopped glaring at her husband long enough to look at me with genuine confusion. "What else did you do, Devon?" Brenda whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own ragged breathing. I did not look at Brenda. I looked directly at Devon, watching the absolute terror completely wash over his face. He knew exactly what I was about to say. He knew I had found the very bottom of his deception. "Tell them, Devon," I commanded, my voice cold and hard as steel. "Tell your mother how you managed to come up with the extra $50,000 Trevor begged you for last week when his payroll bounced." Devon shook his head violently. tears actually beginning to well up in his eyes. "Valerie, please do not do this," he begged, stepping toward me before one of the private security contractors immediately shifted forward, blocking his path. "Please do not say it." But I was merciless. "Since my husband has suddenly lost his ability to speak, I will explain it to you," I said, looking around the room. "When our son Miles was born, I opened a college savings plan. I seeded it with $50,000 of my own money from a stock portfolio I liquidated. I wanted my son to have his entire educational future secured before he even took his first steps. It was a protected account, but Devon, as his father, was listed as an authorized custodian in case of an absolute emergency. Yesterday, while I was holding our newborn son trying to soothe him to sleep after a grueling feeding, Devon logged into that account. He completely drained his own child's college fund, every single penny, and he wired it directly to Trevor's failing beer hobby, just to keep the lights on for one more month. Brenda's knees actually buckled. She gripped the edge of the console table to keep herself from collapsing onto the marble floor. She was hyperventilating now, her chest heaving as she stared at the monster she had raised. "You stole from your own baby," she gasped, clutching her chest. "You stole your child's future for him." Trevor's face turned an even deeper shade of angry red. He opened his mouth to shout another threat, but I held up my hand to stop him. "But we do not even need to debate corporate law today, Trevor," I continued, casually reaching into my pocket. "Because while you were busy running a failing craft brewery into the ground and draining my mother-in-law's retirement accounts, you apparently forgot that my husband is incredibly careless with his digital security. Devon uses the exact same password for his email, his bank accounts, and his cloud storage backups. And since we share a family phone plan, all of his audio messages and voicemails automatically sync to the shared family cloud." I pulled my phone out of my pocket and placed it flat on the table right between us. Devon's head snapped up, his eyes widening in absolute sheer terror as he realized exactly what I was talking about. "Valerie, no!" Devon screamed, lunging forward a step before the taller police officer instantly put a hand on his chest and shoved him firmly backward. I tapped the screen of my phone, pulling up the high-quality audio file I had saved and backed up to multiple secure servers the night before. "You see, Trevor?" I said, looking directly into his panicked eyes. "I do not just have financial records showing the illegal transfer of funds. I also have the actual planning phase of your little criminal enterprise." I pressed play and turned the volume all the way up. The audio was crystal clear, echoing sharply off the marble floors and the high walls of the foyer. Trevor's voice came through the speaker, sounding arrogant and impatient. "Listen, Devon. They need the secondary signatory by tomorrow morning or they pull the commercial credit line. Just sign Valerie's name on the loan documents." Then Devon's voice came through, sounding nervous and hesitant. "I do not know, man. Valerie is meticulous about her credit. If she checks her report and sees a commercial brewery loan, she will kill me. That is forgery, Trevor." Trevor's voice laughed a harsh, dismissive sound. "Calm down, Devon. It is only $50,000. The new seasonal IPA launches next month, and we will pay the credit line back before the statement even generates. She is exhausted with the new baby anyway. Her brain is completely fried. Just forge the signature, Devon. She will never find out." I paused the recording right as Devon quietly agreed to commit the felony. The echo of their voices faded away, leaving a suffocating heavy silence in its wake. Trevor stumbled backward as if the floor had suddenly turned into hot coals, his arrogant posture completely collapsing. Devon was openly sobbing now, his face buried in his hands as his entire life burned to ash. I looked at Trevor, my expression completely unreadable as the two police officers simultaneously unclipped their radios. Trevor stood frozen, his face shifting from a sneer to a mask of sheer panic. He opened his mouth to shout, but the words died in his throat as the reality of the situation finally settled over him like a suffocating shroud. He looked from the police officers to me, then finally back to the laptop screen where the damning evidence of his financial crimes was laid out in agonizing detail. "You really are as dense as you are arrogant, Trevor," I said, my voice calm and steady as I stood up to face him. You see, while you were busy trying to play the part of a big-shot investor, you completely forgot one simple thing. I have spent the last 5 years of my life as a cybersecurity director. I do not just track simple bank transfers, I track digital footprints. I walked around the table moving with the absolute confidence of a woman who had already won the war long before it even started. I gestured toward the laptop screen where several lines of code and server logs were highlighted in red. When you and Devon tried to forge my digital signature on those loan documents, you were careless. You used the public Wi-Fi at your brewery to access the banking portal. It took me exactly 4 minutes to trace the IP address straight to your personal laptop and your home network. I even managed to recover the deleted draft of the document you used to copy my signature from the tax files you accessed illegally. Devon let out a choked sound and collapsed into the chair I had just vacated. His entire body shook with the force of his sobs. He looked pathetic. His tie loosened, his hair disheveled, and his ego completely demolished. "Valerie, please," he whispered, his hands trembling as he reached toward my tablet. "Just delete it. Please." It was a mistake. We were just desperate. The brewery was going to be foreclosed on, and I just wanted to help my family. "You can wipe the file. We can tell the police it was a misunderstanding. Just delete it and we can go back to being a family." I looked down at my husband with a profound sense of clarity. For years, I had mistaken his weakness for kindness and his lack of ambition for a simple life. I realized now that he was just a hollow man who would burn down everything we had built just to feel like he was important in the eyes of people who did not even respect him. The police officers stood their ground, their eyes scanning the room to ensure no one made a sudden move. Trevor was still breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. He realized he was cornered, and his response was not to apologize, but to try one last desperate intimidation tactic. "You cannot prove any of this in court," he growled, his voice dropping to a gravelly threat. "I will get a lawyer. I will claim you hacked my computer. I will say you set us up. You are just an angry woman who wants to ruin her own family over a little money. Who do you think a jury will believe? The successful business owner and the devoted husband, or the woman who is clearly having some kind of mental breakdown?" I did not flinch. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my tablet. The screen was bright and clear, displaying a confirmation email from the Department of Justice. "You are right, Trevor," I said, my voice cold and crisp. "I am an angry woman. But I am an angry woman with a degree in information security and a very low tolerance for being stolen from. You think I recorded this for a jury? You think this is some dramatic performance meant for an audience?" I reached out and pressed a single button on my tablet screen. I watched the status bar move from uploading to sent. "You are wrong about everything, Trevor. I did not just record your little planning session. I did not just gather the IP logs. 48 hours ago, I sent the entire digital footprint and every single piece of evidence to the Financial Crimes Unit. They have been watching your brewery accounts for 2 days. They know about the loan. They know about the forged signatures, and they definitely know about the money you funneled through the college savings account." Trevor went absolutely white, as if all the blood had been drained from his body. He took a stumbling step back, hitting the foyer wall with a dull thud. His breathing was fast and shallow, and the smug, arrogant man who had tried to threaten me only moments ago looked like he might pass out from the sheer weight of his own stupidity. "Your brewery is not just facing bankruptcy anymore, Trevor," I said, moving closer to him so that he could see the absolute finality in my eyes. "It is an active federal crime scene. The agents are likely arriving there as we speak to freeze your assets and seize your books. You wanted to play with big money. You wanted to build an empire. Well, congratulations. You just bought yourself a front-row seat to a federal investigation." The two police officers did not waste another second. They moved with practiced efficiency, grabbing Trevor by the arms and spinning him around to secure his wrists in cold steel handcuffs. He did not even fight back. He was too far gone in his own shock to even make a sound. Devon was still curled in the chair, his face buried in his hands as his mother stood over him in a trance of pure shock and devastation. I stood in the center of my beautiful foyer, the master of my own house and the architect of their total destruction. The game was over, and for the first time since I had married into this family, I felt truly and completely at peace. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs closing around Trevor's wrists echoed through the grand foyer like a gunshot. For a fraction of a second, nobody breathed. Trevor stood completely paralyzed, his face drained of all that arrogant red color, now replaced by the sickly pale hue of a man who just realized his entire life was over. He did not struggle. He did not say a single word. The absolute finality of the federal investigation had completely broken him. Devon was still curled up in the expensive accent chair, weeping uncontrollably into his hands. A pathetic shell of the confident man who had strutted into my house just an hour ago. Brenda was leaning heavily against the marble console table, hyperventilating as she watched her golden child and her son-in-law face the total destruction of their fragile empire. But Jasmine was simply not capable of accepting defeat. The reality of the cold steel handcuffs, the undeniable proof of the wire fraud, and the looming threat of federal prison simply did not compute in her incredibly entitled mind. She stared at the police officers, holding her husband's arms, and then her entire body stiffened with a sudden manic energy. She went absolutely ballistic. She lunged forward, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the polished marble floor, her hands balled into tight, trembling fists. "How could you do this?" Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking and pitching upward until it was a shrill, deafening shriek that made the crystal chandelier above us vibrate. "You are a monster, Valerie. You are a complete traitor to your own people. We are supposed to protect each other from the system. We are supposed to look out for our family, and you just handed my husband over to the federal government on a silver platter because you are too petty to understand business." She was panting heavily, her chest heaving as she pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. She completely ignored the fact that Trevor had just confessed to federal wire fraud on a crystal-clear audio recording. In her twisted, delusional reality, I was the villain for simply refusing to be their financial victim. "You are going to fix this, Valerie," Jasmine demanded, her voice dropping into a desperate, commanding tone that she must have thought sounded intimidating. "You have the money. You clearly have millions hidden away if you bought this massive house in cash, while letting my brother stress over bills. You are going to sit down at that table right now and write a check to cover whatever the feds think Trevor owes them. You are going to pay off the commercial bank, and you are going to tell those federal agents that you authorized the loan transfers. You owe us this. Devon gave you a beautiful family, and this is how you repay him. You write that check right now and get these cops to take those handcuffs off my husband before I completely destroy your professional reputation online." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I simply looked at the finger she had shoved inches from my nose, and then I slowly shifted my cold gaze to meet her furious, frantic eyes. It was truly astonishing to witness the sheer magnitude of her entitlement. She was trying to issue demands in my own home, while her husband stood arrested in the background and her brother wept in disgrace. "You have a very distorted view of loyalty, Jasmine," I said, my voice completely level and stripped of any emotion. "You think loyalty means letting your family bleed me dry so you can pretend to be wealthy on the internet." I turned slightly toward the small antique table and picked up a thick manila envelope that Attorney Harrison had brought with him. I slowly opened the metal clasp and pulled out a dense, heavy stack of printed receipts, invoices, and high-level credit card statements. I held the stack up, letting the heavy silence return to the foyer as the two police officers watched with keen professional interest. "You talk a lot about your online reputation, Jasmine." I continued, casually flipping through the top few pages of the stack. "You love to call yourself a luxury lifestyle influencer. You post unboxing videos of $10,000 bags and limited edition designer shoes every single week. You brag about your exclusive brand deals and your high-end sponsorships to anyone who will listen. You constantly belittle my corporate job because you claim you are building your own personal brand and securing your own bag. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, watching the aggressive fire in her eyes begin to flicker with the very first hint of uncertainty. But we both know those sponsorships are completely fake, Jasmine, I said, letting the words hang heavily in the cold air. You do not have any brand deals. What you do have is a brother who was more than happy to steal my new corporate credit card out of the mail before I got home from work. Jasmine's face instantly drained of color. The confident influencer persona completely evaporated. She took a stumbling step backward, her hands dropping limply to her sides. Her mouth opened, but she could not find a single word to say. Devon gave you the numbers, the security codes, and the expiration dates? I said, my voice ringing clearly across the quiet room. For the last 6 months, you have been routing thousands of dollars in luxury purchases through shell accounts and fake third-party vendors, hoping it would just get lost in the shuffle of my extensive corporate expenses. You bought a vintage Chanel bag, a Cartier watch, and 3 pairs of red-bottom heels just last month using a card issued directly in my name. Brenda let out another loud gasp, covering her mouth with her hands as she stared at her daughter in absolute horror. The entire family was unraveling thread by thread. You genuinely thought I would not notice a sudden spike in my corporate fraud alerts? I asked, tilting my head and studying Jasmine's terrified face. But as I just explained to your husband, I track digital footprints for a living. It is literally what I do all day. I tracked the shipping addresses directly to your apartment. I traced the IP locations used for the purchases to your personal devices. And most importantly, I matched the corresponding times of the transactions to the exact dates you posted those exact same luxury items on your social media accounts. You literally documented your own ongoing felony and broadcast it in high definition to your 50,000 followers. Jasmine began to shake uncontrollably. Her perfectly contoured face crumbled into a mask of pure terror. She looked wildly around the room, realizing there was absolutely no way out of the meticulous trap she had built for herself. She looked at Devon for help, but he just squeezed his eyes shut, unable to even look at her. She looked at her mother, but Brenda was too busy clutching her own chest to offer any protection. I turned away from my trembling sister-in-law and walked directly over to the taller police officer who was standing next to Trevor. I extended my hand, offering him the thick stack of printed receipts, the digital forensic reports, and the photographic evidence compiled from her social media pages. The officer took the file, scanning the top page with a serious expression, before nodding respectfully at me. Officers, I would like to officially press charges for identity theft against my sister-in-law. I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. Jasmine burst into terrified tears. The sound of Jasmine's terrified sobbing bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of my foyer, mixing with the heavy breathing of her husband, who was still pinned against the wall by the police officers. The taller officer calmly flipped through the stack of receipts and IP logs I had handed him, before turning his stern gaze onto my sister-in-law. He reached for his secondary pair of handcuffs and instructed her to place her hands behind her back. Jasmine shrieked a high-pitched wail of absolute disbelief, but she complied, her designer bag dropping to the marble floor with a pathetic thud. She wept loudly, begging for her mother to do something, but Brenda was completely frozen in shock, unable to process the rapid destruction of her children. Devon watched his sister get detained, and it was as if the final string holding his fragile reality together simply snapped. He let out a guttural, choked sob and slid off the expensive accent chair, hitting the cold marble floor hard. He completely ignored his mother, who was wheezing and clutching the console table. He ignored his sister, who was currently crying mascara tears as the cold steel clicked around her wrists. Devon only had eyes for me. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, dragging his body across the polished stone until he was right at my feet. "Valerie, please," Devon begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. He reached up with trembling hands and grabbed the hem of my dress, gripping the fabric like a drowning man clutching a life preserver. Please, Valerie, you have to stop this. Look at what is happening to my family. You are destroying everything. I did not mean for any of this to happen. I swear to you I was only thinking about our future. I did it for us, Valerie. I did it for our family. I did it for Miles. I just wanted to build a legacy so I could provide for my son and be a good husband to you. Trevor told me it was just a temporary bridge loan. He told me the money would be back in the account before you even noticed. I was trying to be the man of the house, Valerie. You have to believe me. I love you. I love Miles. Please just call off the police and let us fix this together. We can go to counseling. We can start over. Just please do not do this to us. I looked down at the man I had married. I looked at his red, blotchy face, his tear-streaked cheeks, and the desperate, pathetic plea in his eyes. I searched my own heart for even a single drop of sympathy or sorrow. I searched for the love I used to feel for him when we first met, when I thought he was just a gentle soul who needed a little support. But there was nothing there. There was no anger left, no sadness, no grief. There was only absolute zero emotion. I felt like I was looking at a complete stranger. Worse than a stranger, actually. I was looking at a parasite that had tried to feed off my hard work and my success while smiling in my face. I gently but firmly reached down and peeled his sweating fingers off the fabric of my dress, brushing his hands away as if they were covered in filth. You did not do any of this for Miles, I said, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any warmth. You did this because you are lazy, Devon. You wanted the title of a successful business owner without doing a single day of actual hard work. You wanted to play the big-shot investor using my money and my credit because you are too weak to build anything of your own. You let your mother disrespect me in my own home. You let your sister steal my identity to buy luxury shoes for her fake internet life. You let your brother-in-law commit federal wire fraud using our newborn son's college fund. You are not a provider, Devon. You are a coward and a thief. I did not wait for him to formulate another pathetic excuse. I simply turned my head and gave a slight nod to Attorney Harrison, who had been standing silently by the front door observing the entire scene with professional detachment. Harrison stepped forward, his leather briefcase resting on the nearby table. He snapped the brass locks open and reached inside, pulling out a very thick, incredibly heavy stack of legal documents bound together by a sturdy blue legal clip. He walked over to where Devon was still kneeling on the floor and dropped the massive stack of papers directly in front of him. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the marble echoed loudly in the foyer, silencing Jasmine's whimpers for a brief second. Devon stared down at the documents, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. His hands hovered over the papers as if they were physically hot to the touch. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the police officer's radio crackling in the background. "What are you doing, Valerie?" I took a small step back, putting a safe distance between myself and the man who had tried to ruin my life. "These are divorce papers." I said, my words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet room. "They are fully drafted and have already been filed with the family court. Right beneath those are the custody filings. I am filing for full physical and legal custody of Miles with zero visitation rights for you until a judge reviews the federal charges pending against you." And the paper right on top, Devon, the one with the red stamp that is an immediate emergency restraining order granted by a judge early this morning. "It dictates that you cannot come within 500 feet of me, our son, or this property ever again." Devon let out a raw, agonizing sound, a sound of a man realizing that his entire existence has just been erased. He stared at the papers, reading the bold black letters of the restraining order that legally barred him from his own child and his own home. I crossed my arms over my chest and looked down at him with eyes as cold as ice. "So here are your options, Devon." I continued, my voice completely steady. "You can stand up, gather whatever dignity you have left, pick up those papers, and walk out of my front door right now. Or you can refuse to leave, and those 2 police officers standing right behind you will gladly add violating an active protection order to your growing list of legal problems, and you can leave my house in handcuffs, just like your sister and your brother-in-law." The choice is entirely yours, but you have exactly 60 seconds to make it. Devon realized in that exact moment that he was totally ruined. His business was an active federal crime scene. His wife was divorcing him. His child was legally protected from him, and his future was completely gone. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cold marble floor, utterly defeated. But then a strange sound pierced the heavy atmosphere of the foyer. It started as a low, wheezing chuckle coming from the corner of the room. We all turned to look. Brenda was still leaning against the console table, but she was no longer gasping for air. Her shoulders were shaking violently as she stared at her arrested daughter, her handcuffed son-in-law, and her weeping, ruined son. The low chuckle slowly escalated, building in volume and intensity until Brenda suddenly threw her head back and started laughing maniacally, her hysterical, unhinged laughter bouncing off the walls and chilling my blood to the core. Brenda's maniacal laughter slowly subsided into a series of sharp, dry chuckles that sounded exactly like dead leaves scraping across cold pavement. The sheer, unhinged energy of her sudden outburst faded away and was quickly replaced by something far more calculated and incredibly cold. She stopped leaning against the marble console table and stood up to her full impressive height. She took a deep, long breath, smoothing her hands down the front of her expensive tailored designer coat, taking deliberate care to adjust the sharp lapels and brush away an imaginary piece of lint from her sleeve. It was a bizarre display of pure vanity in the middle of a total family collapse, but it was completely on brand for my mother-in-law. She looked down at Devon, who was still weeping pathetically on the floor, and then over at Trevor, who was standing silently in handcuffs, and she simply stepped around them as if they were nothing more than discarded pieces of cheap furniture. Her eyes locked onto mine, and the malicious glowing gleam in them was absolutely unmistakable. It was the sound of a carefully constructed 10-year social climbing campaign, hitting a solid brick wall and shattering into a million pieces. Mother Washington's eyes slowly traveled up from Brenda's trembling hand to meet her desperate, panicked gaze. The look of pure, unadulterated disgust on the elder woman's face was absolutely devastating. She looked at Brenda with the kind of profound moral disappointment that completely strips a person of their humanity. Brenda's outstretched hand began to shake violently. Her fake smile twitched and slowly fell away, leaving her looking old, tired, and incredibly small. She slowly lowered her arm, her entire body shrinking under the crushing weight of the matriarch's silent judgment. The very women she had proudly claimed would protect her and ostracize me were now looking at her as if she was the absolute scum of the earth. It was a beautiful, poetic moment of absolute justice. For years, Brenda had used my money, my credit, and my beautiful home to host elaborate luncheons and charity dinners, desperately trying to buy her way onto their exclusive executive board. She had pretended to be a woman of high morals and immense wealth while secretly funneling my hard-earned money to cover her own financial failures and her son's pathetic shortcomings. She had just stood in this exact same room less than 2 minutes ago, claiming her social standing was untouchable and that she would ensure I was a complete outcast in the Black elite community. And now her entire carefully curated world was burning down right in front of her eyes. The sheer panic radiating from Brenda was almost palpable. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer another pathetic excuse, or perhaps to try and redirect the blame onto me as she always did, but the words simply died in her throat. The overwhelming presence of the three matriarchs effectively silenced her completely. These were women who had built real empires, who commanded genuine respect, and who did not tolerate fools or frauds. They had seen right through Brenda's thin veneer of respectability, and they were completely unbothered by her desperate attempts to save face. The absolute rejection was silent, but it was more powerful than any screaming match could ever be. Mother Washington finally moved, but she did not step toward Brenda. Instead, she completely ignored the trembling woman, stepping smoothly and deliberately around her as if Brenda were simply a piece of trash left on the sidewalk. Mother Carter and Sister Hayes followed suit entirely, bypassing Brenda and her handcuffed family members. They walked directly toward me, stopping just a few feet away from where I stood holding my digital tablet. The two police officers took a small, respectful step backward, sensing the immense shift in the room's power dynamic. They recognized that these women were not to be interrupted or questioned. The head matriarch looked at me, her stern expression softening just a fraction. She did not look at the chaos around us. She only looked directly into my eyes, offering me a subtle nod of profound respect. It was a look that communicated volumes, acknowledging the strength it took to stand up to the toxic abuse I had endured for years. She understood exactly what I had done and why I had done it. "Ilea, we received the encrypted financial logs you sent us this morning," she said, her voice clear and carrying absolute authority across the silent foyer. "Is it true?" I maintained steady eye contact with the powerful woman standing before me, and I gave her a single slow and deliberate nod. "Yes, Mum. It is entirely true," I replied, my voice calm and completely steady, refusing to let the emotion of the moment break my composure. Behind them, the sound of a harsh, terrified gasp echoed through the room. Brenda spun around, her fake church voice, completely abandoning her as she stared at us with wide, manic eyes. The reality of her total destruction finally crashing down on her all at once. She looked frantically from the matriarchs to me, her chest heaving as the last shred of her sanity finally gave way. "What logs?" she shrieked, her voice raw and panicked. "What logs?" Brenda stumbled backward, her designer heels suddenly unable to support the weight of her rapidly collapsing world. She looked wildly from Mother Washington to me, her perfectly manicured hands fluttering nervously around her throat as if she were suddenly struggling to breathe in the expansive space of my grand foyer. "What logs?" she shrieked again, her voice cracking into a pathetic, shrill frequency that completely shattered her carefully practiced, elegant tone. "Valerie, what kind of vicious lies have you been spreading to my beloved church family? You are a deeply disturbed woman. Mother Washington, please, you must know she is simply going through a severe mental health crisis. She is trying to destroy my pristine reputation out of pure spite because her marriage is falling apart, and she is desperately looking for someone to blame." I did not raise my voice or take a single step backward. I simply tapped the screen of my digital tablet and turned it so the bright display illuminated the dark, terrified reality, sinking into Brenda's wide, manic eyes. "I have not told them a single lie, Brenda," I said, my voice echoing with absolute surgical precision through the heavy silence of the room. "You just spent the last 10 minutes bragging about your incredible generational wealth, your pristine, flawless reputation, and your massive bank accounts. You paraded around my home acting like a billionaire, untouchable queen. You told Devon you generously gave him $150,000 of your own personal money to help him start Trevor's failing commercial brewery. You made sure to remind him over and over again about your endless financial sacrifices for this family. But that was just another one of your pathetic smokescreens, was it not?" I watched Brenda's face drain of all remaining color until she looked like a wax figure melting under a heat lamp. Mother Washington stepped forward, her presence commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "The logs Valerie sent us this morning show the exact digital footprint of the Atlanta Church Matriarch Council accounts." Mother Washington stated, her voice ringing with pure, holy fury. "The accounts you have personally managed as our highly trusted treasurer for the last 4 years, Brenda. The accounts that held the youth scholarship funds meant to send underprivileged teenagers in our community to college. The accounts containing the building restoration funds collected from the hardworking congregation of our church who trusted you with their tithing and their faithful offerings. You did not give your son your own money, Brenda," I continued smoothly, picking up exactly where Mother Washington left off and ensuring every single word hit her like a physical blow. "You do not have any money. You are drowning in secret debt, just like the rest of your fraudulent family. You embezzled exactly $150,000 directly from the sacred church funds. You systematically drained the youth scholarship accounts over a period of 6 months, and you funneled every single penny into a shadow bank account disguised as your own personal charity organization. And from that fake charity account, you wired the stolen money straight into Trevor's commercial brewery business, pretending it was an angel investment from your own deep pockets. You stole from the youth, you stole from the church, and you used it to fund a criminal enterprise. Brenda let out a blood-curdling scream of pure aggressive denial. She threw her hands over her ears as if physically blocking out the sound of the truth would somehow make the entire nightmare disappear. "It is fabricated!" she howled, spit flying from her trembling lips as she pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. She fabricated the data. She works with computers and digital forensics for her corporate job. She hacked the church system and created those fake wire transfers to frame me. I would never steal from the house of the Lord. I am a woman of God. I run the charity boards. She is a wicked, vindictive witch trying to destroy a righteous woman because she is jealous of my status. I just smiled a cold, dead smile and swiped to the next screen on my tablet, holding it up for the matriarchs and the police officers to see clearly. "I do not need to fabricate anything, Brenda," I said quietly, letting the sheer weight of the evidence crush her remaining defiance. "The digital trail is completely undeniable and permanently etched into the banking mainframes. I tracked the exact routing numbers, the exact timestamps, and the exact IP addresses used to authorize the transfers. And the absolute best part of your sloppy crime is that you authorized every single fraudulent transaction using the church's private secure network while sitting in your own Buckhead mansion using your own personal registered laptop. You literally left your digital fingerprints all over the stolen money. The police officers who are already here to arrest your daughter and your son-in-law have the complete physical dossier containing all the printed bank statements, the signed authorization forms, and the digital network logs proving your guilt." The taller police officer who was still standing next to the handcuffed Jasmine nodded solemnly, confirming that the thick envelope of evidence I had provided earlier also contained the complete financial breakdown of Brenda's embezzlement scheme. The utter silence that followed his nod was heavy enough to crush solid bone. Mother Carter and Sister Hayes looked at Brenda with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound, deep sorrow. The woman they had broken bread with had betrayed their most sacred trust. But it was Trevor who finally broke the heavy silence in the room. He had been standing against the marble wall, sweating profusely as he listened to the entire exchange unfold. The horrifying realization that the initial seed money for his fraudulent brewery was completely stolen from a church charity fund finally penetrated his arrogant, ignorant skull. He suddenly realized that the federal wire fraud charges he was already actively facing were about to be multiplied exponentially by grand larceny and religious charity embezzlement. The federal government was going to bury him under the prison. "I did not know." Trevor suddenly yelled, his voice echoing with sheer, desperate, blind panic. He frantically tried to step away from his mother-in-law, his handcuffed wrists clinking loudly together behind his back. "I swear to God, I did not know it was stolen church money. This crazy old bat just handed me the check and told me it was from her personal investment portfolio. She told me she was filthy rich. She told me she wanted to be a silent partner in the brewery to build generational wealth for Devon. I had absolutely no idea she was stealing from poor kids and a church congregation. She is completely out of her mind. I am a victim here too. You have to believe me, I did not know she was a thief." Brenda absolutely snapped. The refined, elegant church lady persona completely evaporated in a single violent, terrifying second. Hearing herself called a crazy old bat by the very man she had just risked federal prison to financially support pushed her straight over the precipice of sanity. The humiliation, the exposure, and the sudden betrayal by her own criminal son-in-law was simply too much for her fragile narcissistic ego to process. She let out a feral, animalistic screech that did not even sound human and lunged directly at Trevor. She moved with terrifying, aggressive speed, her hands curled into tight, vicious claws. Before the police officers could even react or step between them, Brenda threw her entire body weight against her son-in-law. Her perfectly manicured, sharp acrylic nails raked violently across Trevor's face, digging deep into his cheek and drawing immediate, bright red blood. Trevor screamed in agonizing pain and sheer terror, trying wildly to twist his body away from her assault, but he was completely defenseless with his hands locked tightly behind his back. Brenda kept screaming, swinging her arms wildly and tearing at his clothes like a wild beast, completely destroying the last remaining fragments of her so-called dignified life, right there on the cold marble floor of my foyer. Devon watched his mother completely lose her mind, and it finally jolted him out of his paralyzed state on the floor. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, his expensive dress shoes slipping uselessly on the polished marble as he desperately tried to insert himself between the thrashing matriarch and the bleeding federal criminal. "Mom, stop it!" Devon cried out, his voice cracking with pure panic as he grabbed Brenda's flailing arms and pulled her backward with all his remaining strength. "You are making it worse. Just stop it right now." The taller police officer finally stepped in, using his sheer physical bulk to separate the tangled, violent mess of screaming relatives. He shoved Devon aside without a second thought and grabbed Brenda firmly by her shoulders, physically restraining the wild, thrashing woman against the console table. Trevor was left gasping for air, chest heaving as blood dripped down from 3 deep, jagged scratches across his right cheek. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror as he stared at the woman who had just tried to claw his face off right in front of federal authorities. Brenda was panting heavily, her chest heaving violently as she struggled helplessly against the police officer's iron grip. Her expensive tailored coat was twisted and pulled roughly off one shoulder. Her meticulously styled hair was now a frantic, frizzy mess, and one of her long acrylic nails had snapped off completely, leaving her finger bloody. She looked wildly around the room, her breathing ragged and loud, until her desperate, panicked eyes landed back on the 3 silent church matriarchs. The elder women had not moved a single inch during the entire violent physical altercation. They just stood there, in the bright sunlight, radiating absolute crushing judgment. "Mother Washington, please," Brenda begged, her voice dropping into a pathetic, raspy whine that echoed horribly in the large foyer. She literally sagged against the officer's hands, trying to drop to her knees in a display of ultimate religious submission. "Please, you have to forgive me." It was a momentary lapse of judgment. "I was just trying to help my family survive. I swear on my life. I will make it right. I promise you. I will make the church completely whole again. I will repay every single dime I borrowed from the Youth Scholarship Fund." Brenda was sobbing hysterically now, thick dark mascara tears smearing across her cheeks and dripping onto her ruined designer coat. "I will call my private real estate broker first thing tomorrow morning," she cried, her voice echoing loudly through the quiet foyer. "I will put my multi-million-dollar Buckhead mansion on the market immediately. It is a historic property, and it is worth more than enough to cover the $150,000. I will sell my beautiful home, and I will write a certified check to the church board tomorrow afternoon. I will give you everything I own. Just please do not press charges against me. Please do not strip me of my title on the matriarch board. I will give up my beloved house for the church, I swear to God, I promise you." The absolute absurdity of her desperate lie hung in the heavy, cold air of the foyer. I looked at the woman sobbing on my floor, offering up grand financial sacrifices to save her own skin, and I could not hold it in any longer. A short, sharp laugh escaped my lips. It was a cold, dark sound that immediately drew every single eye in the room back to me. Brenda stopped crying for a fraction of a second, her tear-streaked face twisting in fresh anger at the sound of my amusement. "You cannot sell a house you do not own, Brenda," I said, my voice cutting through her pathetic display like a freshly sharpened blade. Brenda's mouth hung open, but absolutely no words came out. I slowly turned away from the pathetic group of criminals and walked deliberately toward the sleek smart home control panel mounted on the wall near the living room entrance. I tapped the glass screen a few times, connecting my digital tablet directly to the massive 85-inch smart TV mounted on the wall of the formal living room, which was perfectly visible from where the matriarchs and the police were standing in the foyer. The large screen instantly buzzed to life, filling the open space with a bright, stark white glow. I swiped my finger across my tablet, and a highly detailed, heavily stamped official document filled the massive television screen. It was an official legal filing from the Fulton County Clerk's office. Everyone in the room instinctively turned their heads to read the bold black text blaring from the screen. "You love to talk about your multi-million-dollar Buckhead mansion?" I said, my voice ringing out clearly as I pointed to the legal document glowing on the screen. "You love to brag about your generational wealth and your untouchable luxury lifestyle to anyone who will listen. But the truth is, your late husband left you with nothing but a massive mortgage and a crumbling facade that you have been desperately trying to maintain for the last decade. You have been robbing Peter to pay Paul for years, Brenda. And when you finally ran out of credit cards to max out and friends to borrow from you, decided to dip your greedy hands into the church collection plates." I swiped to the next page of the document, magnifying the bottom section so the bright red digital stamps were impossible to ignore. "But even the youth scholarship funds were not enough to save you. Were they?" I asked, tilting my head as I watched her entire body begin to tremble violently. "This is the official notice of foreclosure from your primary mortgage lender, Brenda. You have not made a single payment on your beautiful Buckhead mansion in exactly 14 months. You defaulted on your loan modifications, you ignored the countless certified letters, and you completely exhausted every single legal extension available to you in the state of Georgia." Mother Washington stepped closer to the screen, her eyes scanning the official bank seals and the final eviction notices. The elder matriarch's face hardened into a mask of pure, absolute disgust as she realized the sheer magnitude of Brenda's financial deception. "Your Buckhead mansion was officially foreclosed on by the bank yesterday afternoon," I said, letting the devastating reality of my words sink deep into the bones of everyone standing in the room. "The sheriff's department physically locked the gates and changed the security codes. You do not have a home to sell to repay the church, Brenda. You do not have a backup plan." Devon let out a small, confused gasp, looking wildly from the glowing television screen to his weeping mother. "You told me we were just coming over to visit Miles," he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic squeak. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to the trembling matriarch of the fallen empire, making sure my voice carried absolute finality. "You did not come here to visit your grandson, Brenda," I said, staring directly into her terrified, manic eyes. "You packed your entire life into those leather suitcases, and you brought a luxury moving truck to the end of my driveway because you planned to invade my house today. You came here to manipulate your weak son into letting you live in my guest house because you have absolutely nowhere else to go. You are completely, utterly homeless." The word homeless hung in the heavy foyer air like a physical executioner's blade dropping squarely onto Brenda's neck. The absolute finality of that word echoed off the imported marble walls, completely paralyzing every single member of Brenda's fraudulent family. Mother Washington, Mother Carter, and Sister Hayes did not even blink at the brutal revelation. They simply adjusted their authentic pearls and stared at the shivering, pathetic woman who had just spent the last decade lying directly to their faces. The silence that followed my declaration was so profoundly deep that I could actually hear the ragged, desperate breathing of the criminals standing in my home. Brenda's knees finally gave out entirely. She collapsed onto the hard floor, her designer skirt pooling around her like a deflated parachute as she stared blankly at the massive television screen still displaying her ultimate financial ruin. It took exactly 10 seconds for the reality of utter absolute destitution to finally penetrate Jasmine's self-absorbed brain. She was standing there with her wrists tightly bound behind her back in heavy federal handcuffs, trembling as the full weight of the situation crashed down upon her shoulders. Her beautiful buckhead safety net was completely gone. The massive generational wealth she had constantly bragged about on social media to her country club friends was nothing but a magnificent illusion. Her mother was a desperate thief who had stolen from a church charity and was about to face her own massive grand larceny charges. Her husband Trevor was facing decades in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud. She had absolutely nothing left. No money, no house, no prestige, and no future waiting for her, except the cold, hard reality of a criminal courtroom. The sheer terror in Jasmine's eyes instantly mutated into a vicious, venomous rage. She could not physically attack anyone with her hands bound, so she turned her verbal absolute fury onto the only target left, who was not currently being restrained by a heavily armed police officer. She turned her wild, manic gaze directly onto Devon, who was still cowering on the floor near his weeping mother, attempting to look invisible. "This is all your fault, you pathetic, weak little boy!" Jasmine screamed, her voice echoing shrilly and bouncing off the high ceilings. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated hatred as she glared down at her brother. "You had one job, Devon. One single, simple job. All you had to do was control your stupid wife and secure her money for this family so we could survive." Devon flinched as if she had physically struck him, his eyes darting nervously between his enraged sister and the police officers standing just a few feet away. Jasmine did not care who was watching her meltdown. The polished, sophisticated Southern belle persona was entirely gone, replaced by a cornered, starving animal lashing out at its own pack. "You could not even properly manipulate a woman who was desperately begging you to love her?" Jasmine howled, spitting the words at her brother with absolute disgust. "You were supposed to drain her accounts. You were supposed to put everything in your name. And you were supposed to completely fund Trevor's brewery, so we could all finally be rich and untouchable. But you are too much of a coward. You let her outsmart you. You let her secretly freeze the accounts, and you let her completely destroy us because you are not half the man you pretend to be." Devon scrambled backward on the marble tiles, his face flushing a deep, furious red as his sister's vicious words completely stripped away his fragile masculine ego right in front of the elder church matriarchs. "Do not you dare put this on me," Devon yelled back, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and overwhelming shame. "This was your stupid husband's fraudulent scheme from the very beginning. Trevor is the absolute idiot who thought he could launder fake investment capital through a commercial brewery and not get caught by the federal government. You and Mom are the ones who got so greedy you decided to steal money straight out of the church youth fund to pay for his massive failures. I did everything you asked me to do. I married her, I lied to her, I drained what I could, but she found out. She found out because you two were too sloppy and too arrogant to properly cover your own criminal tracks." The foyer instantly devolved into an absolute nightmare of vicious screaming and chaotic accusations as the villains completely imploded right in front of my eyes. Brenda was sobbing and wailing on the floor, crying out that her own children were ungrateful monsters who did not appreciate the massive criminal sacrifices she had made for their sheer survival. Jasmine was screaming obscenities at Devon, calling him every single degrading name she could possibly think of while violently struggling against the police officer holding her arms. Devon was shouting back loudly, blaming his mother for losing the Buckhead mansion and blaming his sister for bringing the federal authorities straight to our doorstep. They were acting like a pack of rabid, starving wolves, viciously tearing each other apart for the last miserable scrap of rotten meat. I stood there holding my digital tablet completely unbothered and watched their entire toxic family dynamic devour itself. This was exactly who they had always been, underneath the designer clothes and the fake pious church smiles. They were deeply selfish, incredibly greedy parasites who only cared about each other as long as the money was flowing freely. The moment the money disappeared, the loyalty completely evaporated into thin air. Mother Washington simply shook her head slowly, her expression carved from solid granite completely repulsed by the disgusting display of familial rot taking place on my floor. Amidst the deafening chaos of screaming relatives and sobbing frauds, I noticed a very quiet, very deliberate movement happening near the entryway. Trevor, who had been bleeding and completely silent since Brenda's vicious physical attack, was currently attempting to capitalize on the loud distraction his screaming wife and his wailing mother-in-law were creating. The police officer who had been tightly holding him had taken a single half-step forward to help his partner restrain Jasmine's violent sudden thrashing. Trevor saw his tiny window of opportunity. He did not shout, he did not try to defend his screaming wife, and he certainly did not try to protect Brenda from the allegations. His face was pale, his eyes were wide with a deeply cowardly panic, and he was slowly, carefully taking tiny silent steps backward toward the massive mahogany double doors. He was attempting to just quietly slink away, entirely abandoning his wife and his in-laws to face the brutal consequences of their collective crimes all alone. I could clearly see his lips moving rapidly as he muttered frantically to himself under his breath, entirely oblivious to the fact that I was watching his every single pathetic, miserable move. "I am not going down for these crazy people," Trevor whispered frantically, shaking his head as he continued his slow, backward retreat across the marble. "I will roll on all of them. I will call my own lawyer right now, and I will offer full state's evidence to the federal prosecutor. I will tell the feds everything about Brenda's church embezzlement if they just give me a plea deal and immunity. They are all completely insane, and I am not spending the rest of my natural life in a concrete cell for their massive mistakes." He had completely sold out his own wife in his mind before he even made it to the entryway. Trevor turned his back on the screaming, chaotic mess of his ruined family and let out a small, shaky breath of relief as he finally reached the exit. He reached out his handcuffed hands, attempting to awkwardly bump his hip against the heavy brass door handle to let himself out into the bright, quiet afternoon sun. He truly, genuinely believed he was about to orchestrate a brilliant, desperate escape from the collapsing empire. But right as his body pressed heavily against the smooth, dark wood of the door, the massive glass windows flanking the entryway were suddenly illuminated by a blinding, intense flash. Piercing, flashing red and blue lights abruptly flooded the entire foyer, cutting sharply through the bright Georgia sunlight and casting wild, spinning, chaotic shadows across the imported marble floor. The spinning red and blue lights sliced through the grand foyer like strobe lights in a nightmare, completely freezing every single person in the room exactly where they stood. Trevor, who had his hand firmly pressed against the heavy brass door handle, suddenly jerked backward as if the metal had instantly turned red hot. He stumbled away from the glass panels, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream, as the thunderous crunching sound of heavy tires tearing up my immaculate front lawn echoed through the house. 3 massive, unmarked black SUVs had deliberately jumped the pristine concrete curb, completely bypassing the circular driveway and slamming their brakes right in the middle of the manicured grass. They formed a rigid, aggressive barricade directly in front of my porch, effectively sealing off any possible escape route. Right behind them, 2 marked local police cruisers screeched to a halt, blocking the wrought iron gates and boxing in Brenda's ridiculous luxury moving truck, so nobody was getting out of this driveway today. The sheer, overwhelming panic in the room was a living, breathing, physical entity that wrapped its hands around the throats of my enemies. The vicious screaming match between Jasmine and Devon was instantly silenced, replaced by the heavy, suffocating dread of absolute doom. Through the large glass windows flanking the front door, we could clearly see the doors of the black SUVs swing open simultaneously. Heavily armed men and women stepped out onto the crushed grass, moving with terrifying, synchronized precision. They were not local beat cops responding to a minor domestic disturbance. These agents wore dark tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI and IRS printed boldly across their backs. The federal government had officially arrived to collect their dues, and they had brought the entire massive cavalry to ensure nobody slipped through the cracks of the justice system. Trevor backed away from the entrance, his knees physically knocking together, making a pathetic clicking sound in the quiet foyer. His face was completely drained of blood, making the fresh, deep scratches Brenda had just clawed into his cheeks stand out like bright red war paint on a ghost. He tried to turn and run toward the back of the house to find a back door, but his legs simply refused to coordinate with his panicked brain. He just stood there, trembling violently, trapped between the federal agents marching up the front steps and the local police officers already standing right behind him in the foyer. Jasmine, who had been fighting like a wild animal just seconds ago, suddenly went entirely limp as if her strings had been cut. She stared out the window at the IRS windbreakers, and the final devastating reality of her situation completely broke her mind into tiny little pieces. Her husband was not just facing a slap on the wrist or a minor corporate fine. The FBI did not deploy tactical raid teams for simple misunderstandings or clerical errors. They were here to seize everything she owned and lock him away for the rest of his natural life. She realized she was going to be the destitute wife of a federal inmate. The psychological collapse of the family was an absolute masterclass in pathetic cowardice and moral bankruptcy. Devon, who had spent the entire morning puffing out his chest and pretending to be a wealthy, successful businessman, suddenly let out a high-pitched whimpering sound that belonged to a terrified, helpless child. He backed himself into the corner of the foyer, pressing his spine hard against the marble wall, as if he could physically merge with the stone and disappear from reality. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his chest heaving as he stared at the approaching federal agents through the glass. The sheer, unadulterated terror of realizing that his personal signature was on all of those fraudulent commercial brewery loans completely short-circuited his central nervous system. Devon's eyes rolled back slightly, and a dark spreading stain suddenly bloomed across the front of his expensive tailored trousers. He was so paralyzed by pure, absolute fear that he completely lost control of his bladder, right there in the corner, wetting himself as a small dark puddle began to form on the imported tiles beneath his expensive leather shoes. Brenda's reaction was equally grotesque and deeply theatrical as she realized her entire house of cards had finally collapsed. She took one look at the federal letters plastered across the agents' backs, and her entire body folded like a cheap broken lawn chair. She dropped heavily to her knees, the hard impact echoing loudly in the silent room. She clasped her hands tightly together, weaving her fingers so hard her knuckles turned stark white, and she began to pray at the absolute top of her lungs. "Oh Lord Jesus, please protect this family," Brenda wailed, swaying back and forth on her knees as her fake pious church persona kicked into absolute overdrive in a desperate bid for divine intervention. "Please blind the eyes of our enemies and surround us with your holy angels, Lord. We are innocent victims of a wicked conspiracy. Father, please deliver us from these false accusations and smite the demons who seek to destroy our righteous home." She was screaming her desperate prayers toward the ceiling, completely ignoring the fact that her son was cowering in his own urine and her son-in-law was bleeding from the face she had just shredded with her own fingernails. The three church matriarchs, Mother Washington, Mother Carter, and Sister Hayes, watched Brenda's pathetic religious performance with expressions of absolute profound disgust. They did not offer her a single comforting word. They did not join in her frantic screaming prayers. They simply stepped back, making plenty of room for the incoming authorities to handle the toxic trash that had polluted their sacred church community. They knew better than anyone that God does not protect thieves and frauds who use His holy name to steal money from innocent children and hard-working congregations. They watched the downfall of the fake church queen with silent, dignified approval. The heavy mahogany front doors swung open entirely, pushed by the lead federal agent who stepped smoothly over the threshold without bothering to knock or ask for permission. The local police officers already inside immediately stepped back, offering professional, respectful nods to the federal authorities entering my home. The lead agent was a tall, broad-shouldered man with cold, clinical eyes that quickly swept across the chaotic, disastrous scene in my foyer, taking in every single detail. He did not look surprised by Devon's pathetic puddle of urine or Brenda's screaming theatrical prayers. He looked like a man who was thoroughly used to watching arrogant white-collar criminals absolutely break down into weeping toddlers the moment reality finally kicked down their front doors. A team of agents flooded in behind him, quickly securing the perimeter of the room and blocking all exits. The lead agent stopped right in the center of the foyer, planting his heavy boots firmly on the marble floor. He reached inside his dark tactical jacket and calmly pulled out two thick folded documents, holding them up for everyone to clearly see. The silence that fell over the remaining members of the family was deafening and absolute. Even Brenda's frantic wailing prayers choked off in her throat as she stared in abject terror at the official papers clutched in the agent's hand. Trevor looked like he was about to physically vomit, his entire body swaying dangerously on his feet, and Devon just squeezed his eyes tightly shut as if pretending he was asleep would magically make the FBI disappear from my house. Trevor Miller and Devon Vance. The lead agent announced, his deep voice carrying absolute unquestionable authority across the large open room, echoing off the high ceilings. We have federal warrants for your immediate arrest regarding multiple counts of wire fraud, massive commercial mortgage fraud, and extensive tax evasion. The heavy silence that followed the lead agent's declaration was instantly shattered by the chaotic, explosive movement of the federal raid team. Two heavily armored FBI agents immediately flanked the lead agent and moved with terrifying, calculated speed directly toward Trevor, who was still frozen by the massive open front doors. Trevor let out a high-pitched, pathetic squeal that sounded exactly like a wounded animal, as the horrific reality of his massive federal indictment finally registered in his cowardly brain. He tried to scramble backward, his expensive Italian loafers slipping wildly on the polished marble floor, but he had absolutely nowhere left to run. The agents did not hesitate, and they certainly did not offer him a single ounce of grace. One agent grabbed Trevor roughly by the collar of his custom-tailored suit jacket, while the other seized his right wrist, twisting his arm painfully up behind his back. Trevor thrashed and kicked his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror, but the highly trained agents easily overpowered his pathetic civilian resistance. With a loud, echoing crack, they slammed his face and chest directly into the cold, hard marble wall of my grand foyer. The brutal impact knocked the breath completely out of his lungs, and a fresh stream of bright red blood began to ooze from the deep, jagged scratches Brenda had just clawed into his cheek. The harsh, metallic clicking sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the room like the final slamming of a heavy prison cell door. The moment the cold steel locked around his wrists, Trevor completely and utterly lost his mind. The arrogant, smug corporate facade he had weaponized against me for years entirely dissolved, leaving nothing but a pathetic, weeping coward shivering in the grip of federal law enforcement. He began to sob uncontrollably, his hot tears mixing with the fresh blood on his face as he desperately thrashed against the agent's iron grip. "Please, you cannot do this to me!" Trevor screamed, his voice cracking into a hysterical, shrill shriek that bounced off the high, decorative ceilings. "I am a victim here. I swear to God, I did not do anything wrong." "It was Valerie," he cried, pointing a trembling handcuffed finger awkwardly in my direction, while his face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate hatred. "She set me up. She manipulated the financial records to frame me because she hates my wife. She is a vindictive, crazy woman. You have to arrest her, not me." When the federal agents completely ignored his pathetic, desperate lies and began dragging him backward toward the door, Trevor shifted his frantic screaming directly onto Devon. "Tell them, Devon!" Trevor shrieked violently, kicking his legs as the agents hauled his dead weight across the floor. "Tell the feds that you handled all the paperwork for the brewery loans. Tell them you forged the signatures, you useless piece of garbage. I am completely innocent. I am a legitimate businessman." Devon just curled tighter into a pathetic, trembling ball in the corner, sobbing silently as Trevor threw him completely under the proverbial bus without a second thought. The absolute lack of loyalty between these bottom-feeding criminals was truly a magnificent sight to behold. Trevor then turned his wild, panicked eyes toward Mother Washington and the church matriarchs who were watching his disgraceful public meltdown with expressions of cold, unyielding stone. "This is all a setup orchestrated by these angry black women," Trevor yelled, his carefully crafted mask completely slipping to reveal the disgusting racist core he had always kept hidden beneath his fake, polite smiles. "They are all conspiring against me to steal my brewery. They are trying to ruin a successful white man because they are jealous and bitter. You have to believe me." Mother Washington did not even blink at his vile, pathetic outburst. She simply smoothed the front of her immaculate St. John knit suit and stared right through his desperate, flailing body as if he were nothing more than a foul-smelling stain on the floor. The lead federal agent roughly yanked Trevor upright, cutting off his hysterical racist rant with a sharp command to shut his mouth. Trevor continued to weep and beg, his voice growing weaker and more pathetic, as two agents practically carried his thrashing, bleeding body out the front door and down the concrete steps toward the waiting black SUVs. His desperate, pathetic cries faded into the bright afternoon sun, leaving a heavy, palpable tension inside the foyer. Jasmine watched her husband get dragged away in complete silence, her eyes wide and blank as her entire future was shoved into the back of a federal transport vehicle. The lead agent then slowly turned his cold, clinical gaze toward the corner of the room where Devon was still cowering on the floor in a humiliating puddle of his own making. "Devon Vance, get on your feet and place your hands behind your back," the agent ordered, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. Devon did not move a single muscle. He was paralyzed by sheer, overwhelming terror, his chest heaving violently as tears and snot ran freely down his face, ruining his designer shirt. Two IRS agents stepped forward, their faces completely devoid of any human sympathy, as they grabbed Devon by his arms and hauled him roughly to his feet, completely ignoring the stench of fear radiating from him. Devon let out a loud, pathetic wail as they spun him around and slammed him against the wall right next to where Trevor had just been restrained. The sound of the second pair of handcuffs clicking tightly into place seemed to finally break the spell that had kept Devon frozen in panic. He began to thrash weakly against the agent's grip, his entire body shaking violently as the reality of his impending federal imprisonment finally washed over him. The man who had spent years gaslighting me, manipulating my finances, and treating me like a disposable stepping stone for his own selfish ambitions, was now reduced to a weeping, trembling mess, wearing urine-soaked trousers in the middle of my beautiful home. Brenda reached a shaking hand out toward her golden boy, but she was too weak to even stand up, simply sobbing into the marble floor as she watched her son get shackled like a common criminal. As the agents turned him around to lead him toward the open doors, Devon's wild, panicked eyes frantically searched the room until they locked directly onto mine. The sheer, pathetic desperation in his gaze was almost suffocating. "Valerie, please," Devon begged, his voice trembling with a whiny pitch that made my skin physically crawl. "Please, Valerie, you have to help me. You have to call my lawyer. You cannot just let them take me away like this." I stood completely still, my face a mask of absolute unbothered calm as I watched him squirm under the agent's firm grip. He tried to take a desperate, stumbling step toward me, but the federal agents held him firmly in place, their hands like steel vices on his shoulders. "Valerie, please, I am begging you," Devon cried, fresh, hot tears streaming down his pathetic, ruined face. "I am your husband. I am the father of your child. Think about Miles. Valerie, please. You cannot let Miles grow up while his father is locked away in a federal prison. You have to fix this for our family." The sheer audacity of him trying to weaponize my beautiful, innocent son to save his own pathetic skin after he had systematically tried to destroy our lives was the absolute final nail in his coffin. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice. And I did not show him a single ounce of the intense, holy fury burning inside my chest. I simply took 3 slow, deliberate steps across the marble floor, the sharp click of my heels echoing in the quiet room, until I was standing less than 2 feet away from his trembling, weeping face. The federal agents paused for a fraction of a second, sensing the shifting power dynamic and allowing me the space to deliver my final judgment. I looked directly into his red, swollen eyes, my gaze so incredibly cold and empty that Devon actually flinched backward against the wall, trying to escape the absolute finality written all over my face. "Miles only has one parent," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, terrifying whisper that echoed perfectly in the sudden dead silence of the room. "You are just the sperm donor who tried to rob him." I held his terrified gaze for one more devastating second, making absolutely sure he felt the full crushing weight of my utter rejection before I smoothly turned my back on him and walked away without another word. Devon let out a loud, agonizing sob of pure shattered despair as the agents finally dragged him out of the house, his pathetic wails echoing through the front doors as he was hauled down the driveway and shoved roughly into the back of a waiting federal vehicle right next to his weeping brother-in-law. The heavy mahogany double doors remained wide open, framing the devastating scene taking place on the crushed grass of my front lawn. Jasmine stood completely frozen, like a decorative marble statue, staring blankly out the windows as the massive, unmarked federal vehicles swallowed her husband and her brother whole. The roaring engines of the black SUVs faded down the long driveway, taking the last remnants of her fraudulent, luxurious life with them. But the absolute nightmare inside my grand foyer was far from over. The federal agents had successfully secured their high-profile targets, but the 2 local police officers who had arrived much earlier were still standing right there in my entryway, and they had entirely different official business to attend to. The taller local police officer slowly turned his broad, muscular shoulders away from the open doorway and fixed his stern, uncompromising gaze directly onto the sobbing woman crumpled on my polished floor. Brenda was still clutching her chest, rocking back and forth in a state of absolute psychological shock. She had just watched her golden boy son get violently dragged away in federal chains, and her brain simply could not process the sheer magnitude of the destruction raining down upon her head. The officer looked completely past the weeping woman and respectfully nodded toward the 3 elder church leaders who were standing together like a tribunal of ancient judges. "Mom," the officer said, his deep voice calm but incredibly firm, cutting sharply through Brenda's pathetic, wet whimpering. "Are you acting as the official representative of the church board regarding the stolen funds today?" Mother Washington took a slow, deliberate step forward. Her highly polished orthopedic shoes clicked sharply against the stone tiles, echoing with absolute finality. "Yes, officer, I most certainly am," she stated, her voice ringing out with crystal clear, unwavering conviction. "On behalf of the entire pastoral board and the congregation, we are formally pressing criminal charges against Brenda Vance for the grand larceny and felony embezzlement of $150,000 from our Youth Scholarship Fund. We have officially provided all the fraudulent bank statements, the forged signature documents, and the heavily altered financial ledgers directly to your department this morning. We want her prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of the law." The heavy words hit Brenda like a physical blow from a solid wooden bat. Her frantic rocking instantly stopped. Her tear-streaked face shot upward, her mouth falling wide open in an expression of pure, horrified disbelief. The protective, arrogant delusion she had wrapped herself in for decades finally shattered into a million jagged, irreparable pieces. They were actually doing it. Her own prestigious social circle, her powerful church allies, the women she had spent her entire adult life trying to desperately impress and manipulate, were actively throwing her to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. "No, no, please!" Brenda shrieked, a raw, guttural, animalistic sound tearing violently from her throat. She did not even try to stand up on her feet. Instead, she scrambled forward frantically on her hands and knees, her expensive tailored coat dragging pathetically underneath her, as she practically crawled across the cold marble tiles toward the three elder women. "Mother Washington, please, I am begging you," Brenda cried out, stretching her trembling arms forward. She reached out and desperately grabbed handfuls of the thick woolen fabric at the hem of Mother Washington's conservative dress, clutching the material as if it were the absolute last life preserver in a violently churning black ocean. "You cannot do this to me!" "Mother Washington." Brenda sobbed uncontrollably, her thick, dark mascara completely running down her face in ugly, muddy rivers. "I am a woman of God. I am a matriarch just like you. Please, you have to show me true Christian forgiveness. The good book says we must forgive those who trespass against us. Please show me mercy. I am begging you on my hands and knees. I made a terrible momentary mistake, but I was only trying to protect my family and keep a roof over my children's heads. Do not let them lock me in a dirty cage. I will do anything you want. I will scrub the church floors on my knees. I will publicly confess my terrible sins to the entire congregation every single Sunday. But please do not send me to prison." The three elder women looked down at the hysterical, grasping woman with an expression of such profound, chilling revulsion that it actually made the air in the foyer drop 10 degrees. Mother Washington did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. She did not reach down to comfort the weeping woman. Instead, she yanked her skirt violently out of Brenda's desperate grip, taking a huge, deliberate step backward. Mother Carter and Sister Hayes immediately mirrored the harsh movement, physically recoiling from the sobbing fraud on the floor, as if Brenda were covered in a highly contagious flesh-eating disease. "Do not you dare quote Holy Scripture to me, you wicked, deceitful woman," Mother Washington said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that commanded absolute, terrified silence. "You did not steal from the rich, Brenda. You stole directly from poor, innocent children who were relying on that scholarship money to escape generational poverty and build a real future. You robbed the absolute most vulnerable members of our community, just so you could keep living in a hollow, foreclosed mansion and pretend you were somehow better than everyone else. You are not a woman of God, and you are certainly not a matriarch." Mother Washington looked down her nose, her dark eyes burning with righteous, holy fury. "Effective immediately, you are permanently stripped of your title, your prestigious position on the board, and your membership in our congregation. Your name will be completely erased from every plaque and every committee list. When the congregation learns exactly what you have done, you will be a total pariah. No one in Buckhead, no one in the city of Atlanta, and no one in our entire community will ever associate with you again. You are nothing to us now. You are just a common, dirty thief." Brenda let out a devastated, wailing scream, covering her face with her shaking hands, as her entire identity, her entire prestigious social universe was completely vaporized in a matter of seconds. She had no money, no home, no son to manipulate, and now she had absolutely zero social standing. She was completely and utterly ruined forever. The taller police officer did not wait for her to finish crying her fake tears. He stepped forward firmly, grabbing Brenda by her upper arm and hauling her roughly to her feet. She was completely dead weight, sobbing hysterically as the officer spun her around and pulled her flailing arms behind her back. The heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed sharply over Brenda's, pathetic wails locking her wrists tightly together. "Brenda Vance, you are under arrest for grand larceny and felony embezzlement." The officer stated, his voice flat and clinical, completely devoid of any human emotion. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." As the officer continued reading her Miranda rights, he began to march her forcefully toward the open front door. Brenda stumbled over her own expensive ruined shoes, her designer clothes twisted and pulled her hair a frantic, wild, frizzy mess. But right before she crossed the threshold out into the blinding afternoon sun, she stopped struggling for just one fraction of a second. She turned her head and locked her dark, swollen eyes directly onto mine. The sheer intensity of the pure, unadulterated hatred radiating from her glare was absolutely staggering. She looked at me as if she wanted to physically reach across the room and tear my beating heart right out of my chest. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not look away. I stood incredibly still, radiating absolute calm, devastating power. I slowly reached out and picked up my delicate china teacup from the sleek console table right beside me, maintaining perfect, unbroken eye contact with the ruined, screaming matriarch. I raised the fragile cup into the air, offering her a silent, victorious toast before taking a slow, highly satisfied sip as the police dragged her out of my house forever. The heavy mahogany double doors finally slammed shut with a loud, echoing thud, completely cutting off the sound of Brenda's hysterical wailing and leaving the grand foyer bathed in a sudden, heavy silence. I slowly lowered my teacup, the delicate porcelain clinking softly against the saucer, in a sound that felt incredibly loud in the massive, empty space. The air in my home finally felt clean again, completely purged of the toxic, suffocating presence of my criminal in-laws. I took a deep, long breath, letting the reality of my absolute total victory settle deep into my bones. My eyes slowly traced the chaotic scuff marks on the imported marble floor, moving past the humiliating dark puddle Devon had left behind, until my gaze finally landed on the very last remnant of the fallen empire. Jasmine was still standing near the entryway, completely frozen in place like a terrified animal caught in the blinding headlights of a speeding truck. She was entirely alone now. Her fraudulent husband Trevor was currently sitting in the back of a heavily armored federal vehicle facing decades in a maximum security prison for massive wire fraud. Her scheming, cowardly brother Devon was locked in a separate police cruiser weeping in his own filth after being exposed as a spineless accomplice. And her untouchable powerhouse mother Brenda had just been permanently stripped of her precious social status and hauled away in iron handcuffs by the local authorities to face grand larceny charges. The beautiful Buckhead mansion she had bragged about endlessly to anyone who would listen was legally foreclosed and firmly padlocked by the sheriff's department. The federal agents had undoubtedly already moved to freeze every single bank account and offshore trust tied to her name. Jasmine was standing in my grand foyer, clutching two ridiculously expensive leather designer bags so tightly against her chest that her knuckles were entirely white. Those two bags contained absolutely everything she had left in the entire world. The house was mostly empty now except for the two massive private security guards I had hired standing silently near the front windows. Jasmine's meticulously styled hair had fallen flat, and her perfect expensive makeup was starting to run down her cheeks in dark, pathetic streaks. The realization of her absolute, utter destitution finally hit her, causing her entire body to begin trembling violently. She looked wildly around the massive, empty foyer, as if desperately hoping to find a hidden exit or a magic wand that could somehow reverse the last hour of total devastation. But there was no escape, and there was no magic. There was only me standing there radiating absolute unbothered control, while she slowly drowned in the reality of her new impoverished life. Jasmine slowly turned her head to look at me, her wide, terrified eyes completely stripped of the arrogant, haughty disdain she had worn like a heavy diamond crown since the very first day I met her. Her chin quivered uncontrollably, and her perfectly plumped lips parted in a desperate gasp for air. She took a slow, unsteady step forward, her expensive designer heels clicking weakly against the cold marble tiles. She literally dropped her heavy leather bags, letting them fall carelessly to the floor as she raised her shaking hands in a desperate, pathetic, pleading gesture. The heavy thud of the luggage echoed loudly, but Jasmine did not even blink. She just kept walking toward me until she was standing just a few feet away, entirely dropping her arrogant facade and completely abandoning every last ounce of her southern pride. "Please, Valerie," she whispered, her voice cracking and breaking into a hoarse rasp that sounded absolutely nothing like the sophisticated, wealthy woman she pretended to be. Hot, thick tears finally spilled over her long lashes and ran rapidly down her face, ruining her perfect complexion. Please, I have absolutely nothing left. The FBI agents told me they were seizing all of our assets. My black cards are instantly declined. I do not have a beautiful house to go back to tonight. My mother is going to county jail, and my husband is facing serious federal charges. I am entirely completely broke, Valerie. I do not even have money for a cab ride. Jasmine actually sank down slightly, her knees bending weakly, as if she were about to physically crawl to my feet, just like her mother had tried to do with the church matriarchs. Please, I am begging you, she sobbed, her voice rising into a frantic, desperate whine as the true horror of homelessness washed over her. We are family, Valerie. I am your sister-in-law. I am little Miles' aunt. You cannot just throw me out onto the street like a stray dog. I know we have had our differences in the past, and I know I said some terrible things to you this morning, but I am absolutely desperate. Just let me sleep in the guest room. You have so much room in this massive house. I do not need the master suite. I will stay out of your way entirely. Just let me have one small room in the back until I can figure out what to do with my life. I will help around the house. I will cook. I will clean. I will do anything you ask me to do. Just please do not send me out there. I have literally nowhere else to go. I stood there looking down at the weeping, trembling woman who had spent years making my life an absolute living hell. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her request was almost physically staggering. This was the exact same woman who had strutted into my foyer less than 2 hours ago, carrying those exact same designer bags, arrogantly demanding that I pack my things and vacate my own property so she could claim my master bedroom as her own. This was the woman who had openly mocked my background, who had insulted my intelligence, and who had actively conspired with her criminal husband to completely bankrupt me and leave me destitute on the street. She had desperately wanted to ruin me so she could maintain her fake luxurious lifestyle. And now she was standing on my floor begging to be my live-in maid just for a tiny corner of the very home she had tried to steal. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy for her. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I only felt a profound, overwhelming sense of highly satisfying justice. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, closing the final distance until I was looking dead into her terrified, tear-streaked eyes. My expression was completely blank, devoid of any mercy or forgiveness. "You are not my sister," I said, my voice cutting through her pathetic sobbing like a freshly sharpened blade. "And you stopped being my son's aunt the very moment you conspired to steal his financial future to pay for your husband's fraudulent brewery." Jasmine's mouth opened in a silent gasp as the absolute finality of my words struck her right in the chest. She stared up at me, completely paralyzed, realizing that the very last door had just been slammed permanently shut in her face. "You wanted me to leave my own house," I said, my tone dropping into a deadly quiet register that left absolutely no room for any negotiation. "Now it is your turn." I turned my head slightly, looking past her trembling form toward the 2 large security guards who were standing silently by the entryway. "Security, escort her to the sidewalk," I commanded, my voice ringing clear and authoritative across the marble floor. Jasmine let out a sudden, piercing shriek of pure, absolute horror as the 2 massive guards stepped forward, grabbing her firmly by the arms. They did not hesitate, physically marching her backward toward the open doors. She thrashed and kicked violently, wailing desperately into the morning air as she was dragged forcefully away from her very last hope. Her expensive designer bags were left completely abandoned on my foyer floor as she was marched down the driveway and physically thrown out onto the public sidewalk. Her hysterical sobbing echoing down the street as the heavy gates finally closed on her forever. 6 months passed since the heavy iron gates of my estate clicked shut, locking the absolute toxicity of that parasitic family out of my life for good. The swift and brutal wheels of the federal justice system did not hesitate as they ground their completely fraudulent empire into fine dust. The local news stations and the daily business journals had an absolute field day covering the spectacular public collapse of the once prestigious Vance family. It was a highly publicized media circus that dominated the headlines for weeks, and it ended with a row of devastating prison sentences that left them with absolutely nothing. Trevor, the arrogant mastermind who thought he could use my infant son's financial future as a personal corporate piggy bank, stood before a federal judge and openly wept like a terrified child. He was handed a mandatory 10-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary for massive wire fraud and racketeering. His smug corporate facade was entirely replaced by an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit and the cold reality of a tiny concrete cell. Devon, the spineless coward, who had spent our entire marriage actively gaslighting me and forging banking signatures, crumbled completely during his trial. He desperately tried to pin the entire criminal operation on his brother-in-law weeping on the stand, but the federal prosecutors had established an airtight paper trail. The judge showed absolutely no mercy to a father who was willing to bankrupt his own child, sentencing Devon to 5 hard years in federal lockup without the slightest possibility of early parole. Brenda's highly anticipated criminal trial was the absolute talk of the Buckhead elite. The woman who had spent decades aggressively positioning herself as the untouchable matriarch of local high society was publicly humiliated in the worst possible way. When the church board submitted decades of deeply damning financial records detailing her extensive thievery, the judge handed her a solid 3-year sentence for felony embezzlement and grand larceny. But the prison time was only a small fraction of her true punishment. Brenda was officially a total social pariah. Her beloved country club memberships were permanently revoked. Her former society friends actively crossed the street to avoid making accidental eye contact with her during her brief bail period. The sprawling, luxurious mansion she loved bragging about so much was swiftly seized by the bank and quickly sold at a public auction to pay off her massive mounting restitution debts. And then there was Jasmine, my former sister-in-law, the fiercely arrogant woman who had boldly marched into my foyer demanding the keys to my master bedroom, was now living an entirely different nightmare. With her husband sitting in a federal prison, her mother locked away in a state facility, and all of their fraudulent assets completely seized by the government, Jasmine was forced to face the real world with absolutely zero marketable skills and no safety net. The last I heard through the local gossip mill, she was renting a tiny, cramped apartment in a highly dangerous part of town and working the grueling overnight shift at a greasy fast food diner. The proud woman who used to refuse to carry a designer bag from a previous season was now spending her long, exhausting nights scrubbing burnt grease off industrial fryers just to scrape together enough coins to make her monthly rent. The stark, incredible contrast between their miserable, self-inflicted reality and my beautiful, peaceful present could not have been more profound. I sat back comfortably in the thick plush cushions of my outdoor patio furniture, letting the warm, gentle afternoon sun wash over my face. My sprawling backyard garden was currently in full, spectacular bloom with bright, vibrant hydrangeas and perfectly manicured rose bushes, creating a lush, private sanctuary that felt miles away from any trouble. The gentle, soothing sound of the decorative stone fountain trickling nearby was the perfect background music to the beautiful symphony of my restored life. Right beside me in his premium luxury stroller, Baby Miles let out a loud, happy cooing sound, kicking his chubby little legs in the warm, fragrant air. He was thriving, growing bigger and stronger every single day, completely safe and entirely oblivious to the massive dark storm that had almost wiped out his entire future. I leaned over and gently tickled his soft, round cheek, listening to his bright, infectious laughter ring out across the sunlit patio. We were absolutely safe, and we were finally surrounded by people who genuinely loved us without any hidden agendas or toxic manipulative conditions. The heavy glass patio doors swung open, and the joyful celebratory sound of popping champagne corks echoed loudly out into the garden. My true family was pouring out onto the expansive stone terrace, carrying heavy silver trays of incredible food and holding up expensive crystal glasses. It was not a family bound by toxic bloodlines or manipulative obligations, but a beautiful chosen family built on absolute mutual respect, unconditional support, and genuine love. My mentor, Helen, who had guided my career for years, walked over with a massive bright smile, handing me a tall glass of sparkling cider. My closest friends and my most loyal colleagues gathered tightly around my chair, raising their glasses in a joyous unified toast to celebrate my massive new promotion to Executive Senior Vice President of the firm. They cheered and clapped loudly, their genuine pride and love washing over me like a warm, protective blanket. I looked around at their smiling, joyful faces, and then down at my beautiful, healthy son, and I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of total, absolute victory. The dark, oppressive shadow of the Vance family was completely gone, permanently erased from our lives like a bad dream. They thought blood gave them the right to bleed me dry. They thought my silence was weakness, and that my careful patience was simply blind submission. They genuinely believed I was just a convenient, quiet stepping stone. They could casually step on and discard whenever it suited their greedy, selfish needs. But I did not just lock the door on them. I burned their entire fraudulent house of cards right down to the ground. Now I own my home, I own my peace, and nobody will ever threaten my sons. Legacy again. True family is not defined by blood or marriage, but by consistent respect and genuine unconditional love. When toxic people try to tear you down and manipulate your life for their own selfish gain, you must stand firm and ruthlessly protect your boundaries. You do not owe any loyalty to those who actively scheme to destroy you or steal your peace. Real strength comes from walking away from abusive environments and building your own beautiful sanctuary where you can truly thrive. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your own peace and future? Share your survival story in the comments below, and please subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of triumph and reclaiming your independence.